Well, I'm sure you would have noticed that what we saw happen yesterday, what we've seen at this strike, is workers, well, feeling frustrations, the anger I think many people feel in our society at the moment. We're seeing workers really feeling it. There's the long-running strike at Sibanye-Stillwater, that face-to-face meeting to happen on Thursday. Workers are demanding an increase of 1,000 rand a month. Their boss, the CEO, Neil Froneman, was paid 300 million rand last year through share options he had. Then there's the incident yesterday involving COSATU members. They refused to allow President Cyril Ramaphosa to speak at that event in Northwest. Tony Healy is a Labour consultant. He joins us now. Tony, good afternoon to you. I appreciate the time on a public holiday. There are many different dynamics going on here. There's a lot going on. I think many people have sympathy with workers at the moment. Are tensions higher than they've been, perhaps at any times in the democratic era?
Good afternoon, Stephen. I'm not so sure they are. I mean, I think tensions have been high for many years, and I think what we saw yesterday is just a manifestation of similar dynamics that we've seen evolving probably over the last almost 30 years since the dawn of democracy.
In a way, maybe what we're seeing is the interests of the head of state or the interests of the governing party being different to unions and workers. And of course their interests are different.
Yes, indeed, Stephen. And, I think a lot was happening yesterday. If we look at the fact that unions have, as you've been discussing earlier today, decreased in membership over time for lots and lots of reasons. Unions have fragmented. There is atypical employment. If you think about it, in the last 30 years, union memberships dropped from about 2 in 5 to about 1 in 5. So frustrations increase. And I think we mustn't forget that a lot of those that attended the meeting, we mustn't forget they're coming from locations and townships where they have also grievances relating to service delivery and perhaps concerns around corruption. So there's probably more than just a manifestation of a labor dispute in the drama that unfolded.
There are other dynamics perhaps as well. I mean, I would suggest that workers, people with jobs, are probably feeding more members of their family than they were before the pandemic, because so many people lost their jobs. So if one worker was feeding maybe 9 people, now maybe they're feeding 10 or 11, or they're looking after, their brother's child or whatever it is, or children. At the same time, you have commodity prices going up, Neil Froneman getting 300 million rand. That's not filtering down to workers. I mean, that's a recipe for disaster, isn't it?
Well, absolutely right. So the commodity run has not, that can't be ignored. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the average employed person, which, to be honest, is about 1 in 2 in this country at the moment, has a far greater and wider responsibility when it comes to feeding others than would have been the case 10 or 20 years ago.
So, I mean, are the mines just wrong? I realize that, it's always hard to say that. But, I mean, it would seem to, I'm not a mining company expert. I know nothing about accounts. But it looks to me as if, well, I mean, in a situation like this, it's pretty obvious what you do. You increase wages.
Well, Stephen, I think we mustn't forget that we need to, there are so many facets involved in a collective bargaining process. What's fair to you, what's fair to me, what's fair to somebody else. At the end of the day, from my perspective, looking at it purely from a labor relations point of view, at the end of the day, when it comes to the bargaining table, it's your bargaining power that's going to influence where you end up. And, gone are the days of Cyril Ramaphosa himself in 40 years ago, with a 500,000 strong national union of mine workers, and a fairly highly performing commodities market, and heightened consciousness. I mean, we don't see today, for example, the same kind of firebrand, charismatic trade union leaders leading these mammoth trade unions with tremendous bargaining power. We've seen tremendous fragmentation of trade unions in the last 20 years. We've seen a tremendous drop in union membership. And all of that conspires to reduce the bargaining power of these union members. So on the one hand, we can say, well, yes, they should get this and they should be paid that. But on the other, at the end of the day, they're arriving at the bargaining table, in my view, today in a much weaker position than they were in years gone by. And that, I think, is more of the problem, because, what threat do they really pose? That's what the employer will be saying. What threat do they really pose? And they just don't pose the same threat as they did in years gone by.
We don't just see it in mining, do we? I mean, I remember Zwelinzima Vavi, General Secretary as he then was of COSATU, addressing massive events, 50,000 people in the center of Tshwane, having the Minister at the time, Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi, coming out, protected by police officers, and him hugging her on the stage to make the point that they were part of the same movement. Those days have gone completely. NUMSA's left, everything changed at that point.
That's right, and those of us old enough to remember will recall exactly that. Masses of strikers marching and picketing through CBDs and the like. Now, the fact of the matter is, NUM is a shadow of its former self. For example, ANCU's filled a void to a degree, but still, the whole mining sector has been decimated in the last 20 years. And you can really look at any sector and say to yourself, you know what? We're old enough to remember when there were massive, unprotected, violent strikes in the last 10 to 15 years. We've seen none of that, pretty much none of that in the last 5 years at least. And that, to me, there's a lot of dynamics involved there, but that, to me, tells us that, first and foremost, rightly or wrongly, the organized labor in this country, and worldwide, by the way, to a large degree, organized labor has fallen away in numbers to the extent that they simply don't have the bargaining power to put the pressure on the mines and big business in general.
I suppose that there are lots of questions as to why. Was it just leadership? Was it just this is what happens? Was it just politics? I mean, in a way, it was perhaps what happened in the ANC in Polokwane. There are other factors, I imagine.
There's lots of reasons, Stephen. You can't ignore the economy over the last 20 years. You can't ignore, I saw you had William Adisha on a little earlier. I mean, competent leaders like that. So many of them in the last 27 years have progressed into a political life. So once you become a competent trade union leader, you have an aspiration into politics. So good leadership is lost. I don't think that unions are as well led. I don't think that they have, as I mentioned a moment ago, the same kind of firebrand, charismatic leaders. They certainly don't have as many members to muster, so they lose that bargaining position, especially in the private sector. The private sector, has a union density of maybe 1 in 8 employees are union members. It's maybe closer to 6 in 10 in the public sector. But, and let's not forget a lot of other things have happened. I mean, in the bygone days when you had these high union membership numbers, we were talking about a scenario where you didn't have the atypical employment that you have today, where typically all you had was permanent employees. But what we've seen in the last 10, 15, 20 years is this evolution into atypical employment, or what Labour would call precarious employment. In other words, any form of employment that's not permanent. So, for example, labour broker services, part-time work, piecemeal work. And, of course, it's much, much harder to organize those kinds of workers, and it's much harder for them to pay the union fees that have to be paid.
In many countries, unions have played a big political role over the years, including in this country. They've brought real change to society, and not just politically in terms of social movements. If you want to look at, for example, rights for gay people in South Africa, unions would have played a role in that. They would play a role in protecting a country against corruption. I think you could argue strongly that COSATU did that during the Zuma era. Sort of very aware of what I'm saying there. So that would mean that in a country like ours, with very high unemployment, the worst inequality in the world, I mean, we all know the problems that we have, where there's so much anger at government, at the rich, at everything, that unions would be the one organization that could lead to real social change in South Africa again. From what you're saying, they're just not in a position to do that.
Well, yes, and I think, I think that's all fair and well, and you're absolutely right, Stephen, and we can go all the way back to Solidarity in Poland so many years ago, and there are lots of local examples. That's fair and well if as a trade union you're covering your basics well. And remember, your rank and file union member is looking fundamentally for job protection and is looking for their conditions of employment to be enhanced. And they may worry about the interest rate, and they may worry about gay rights, and they may rightfully be concerned about these social factors, but the very first reason they sign a debit order is to give them greater job security and to enhance their conditions of employment. And that's where I think a lot of our unions have missed the trick as well. I think they become too embroiled in the kind of less core aspects of union life and forgotten what the rank and file union members are looking for in their 50, 60, 90 rand a month subscription, which is improve my job security and materially improve my conditions of employment. Cover those bases first. If you're covering those bases well, and you've got time thereafter to worry about interest rates and service delivery, then that's fine. But don't do that at the expense of which I think what a lot of South African unions have done, at the expense of not fulfilling the fundamental reasons why a worker joins a union in the first place.
Tony, I did ask an earlier guest on this. I'd be interested in your view as well. We see, for example, in our country, unions that have a political bent. Let me be very sort of crude in this. You'll see the NUM, as you've referred to, sort of mainstream, part of the Congress movement, part of the ANC. AMCU, much more radical, usually has higher demands, working with the NUM at the moment. Also part of the same strike, Solidarity, representing, I'm presuming again, mostly white, probably Afrikaans-speaking workers. In a way, this is our society. Could there be space for an apolitical union, someone that only concentrates on what you're talking about, giving a worker value for money for that debit order?
Well, look, many unions would claim to be atypical, Stephen. There really are a number that would say, we're atypical. I mean, to a large degree, AMCU itself would claim to be atypical. For me, as well, a very big factor in this power dynamic is the fact that there's just so much fragmentation. I mean, we're even hearing about the EFF Labour's desk now wanting to form a union. That's just going to cause greater fragmentation. I mean, one of the worst things for Labour, I think, was the fact that COSATU split when it did, because instead of having one, and we can all remember when, COSATU was knocking on the door of having nearly 2 million members within its federation. The minute that the SAFTU group broke away, that weakened COSATU considerably. It also, SAFTU itself, it's got a couple of big unions. Of course it does. It has the biggest in the country, NUMSA, but it's not been significant. And here's an example. COSATU had one union, one industry approach. So they had one transport trade union. The minute SAFTU broke away, suddenly everybody and their dog wanted to open a transport union, and eventually to the extent that there are currently about 6 different trade unions, if not more, servicing the transport industry. So all of these factors contribute to, in my view, the continued weakening of the presence of organized labor.